April 1945. The war in the Pacific is reaching its climax. The US military has fought its way across island after island, and now, just 350 miles from Japan's mainland, it prepares for its largest amphibious assault of the campaign. Okinawa, a rugged, rain-soaked island carved with caves and ridges where tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers are dug in, waiting. Their orders are clear: make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. What followed was one of the longest and deadliest battles of the entire war. Not just for the soldiers and Marines fighting it, but for the civilians caught in between. For 82 days, the fight for Okinawa would push men to their breaking point. Entire units would be wiped out in a single night. The US Navy would suffer its worst losses of the war. And in the end, over 200,000 people, American, Japanese, and local civilians, would be dead. But why was this battle so brutal? What was it like to fight in places where survival was measured in yards? And how did Okinawa shape the final months of the war, leading to a decision that would change history forever? This is the Militia Historia podcast, and today we take you to the last great battle of the Pacific, Okinawa. To most Americans in 1945, it was just another name on a map, another island in a long list of battles that had stretched across the Pacific. But for US military planners, it was something much more, the last stepping stone to Japan itself. At just 466 square miles, Okinawa wasn't the largest island captured in the war, but it was the most important. Only 350 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's home islands, it was the perfect staging ground for a full-scale invasion. The plan was straightforward: take Okinawa, build airfields, and use them to launch the final assault on Japan. For the men on the ground, though, strategy mattered less than survival. By early 1945, they had already fought through some of the worst battles of the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each island had been a lesson in brutality. Okinawa would be no different. The Japanese knew the Americans were coming. They had watched the island-hopping campaign move ever closer to their homeland. Now, with Okinawa in the crosshairs, they prepared for a defense unlike any seen before. No more throwing men into suicidal banzai charges. No more meeting the enemy on the beaches. This time, they would make the Americans bleed for every hill, every ridge, every cave. The stage was set. On April 1st, 1945, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War began. But what awaited the Americans wasn't what they expected. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. As the sun rises over the Pacific, a massive Allied armada surrounds Okinawa. More than 1,300 American ships, carriers, battleships, destroyers, transports stretch across the horizon. The invasion fleet is so vast that some sailors claim you could walk from one deck to another without touching the water. At the heart of the assault, the US 10th Army, over 180,000 soldiers and Marines, prepares to storm the beaches. They've seen the reports, studied the maps, they know what to expect. Every island they've hit so far, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, has been a bloodbath. The Japanese fight to the death. The beaches are always the worst part. But as the first wave reaches Okinawa's western beaches, nothing happens. No gunfire, no artillery, no hidden bunkers spitting machine gun fire, just silence. Confused but relieved, the Marines and soldiers push inland. By nightfall, they've taken the Kadena and Yontan airfields, key objectives that should have cost hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. Instead, they take them almost without resistance. It's not until later that they realize what's happening. The Japanese aren't defending the beaches at all. They're waiting. For the first few days, the invasion of Okinawa seemed almost too easy. The American forces pushed inland, seizing airfields and key roads with barely a fight. Some began to wonder if the Japanese had simply abandoned the island. Then, on April 6th, the real battle began. From the hills and ridges of southern Okinawa, Japanese guns opened fire. Mortars, artillery, machine guns, thousands of rounds poured down on the advancing US troops. The beachhead was secure, but the true killing ground was further inland. The Japanese had spent months turning Okinawa's landscape into a fortress. Beneath the hills lay a vast network of tunnels and bunkers, reinforced with concrete, hidden behind thick vegetation. It seemed every ridge was a stronghold. Every cave concealed machine gunners. Every step forward was paid for in blood. For the Americans, this was a new kind of nightmare. There were no clear front lines. Enemy soldiers appeared from hidden tunnels, struck without warning, then vanished underground. The deadliest of these battlegrounds was Shuri Line, a formidable defensive network stretching across the southern part of the island. Here, the Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had dug in deep. Entire hillsides were honeycombed with bunkers, artillery nests, and interconnecting tunnels. For weeks, US forces hurled themselves at these positions. Flamethrowers and grenades were the only way to clear the caves, but for every stronghold taken, another waited just ahead. The names of these places would become etched in the memories of those who fought there: Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, and Conical Hill. This wasn't just another battle. This was attritional warfare at its worst, and it was only getting started. The Battle of Okinawa wasn't just about strategy or territory. It was about endurance. It was a test of who could last longer in a fight where the only certainty was suffering. By late April, the American advance had slowed to a crawl. At Kakazu Ridge, the fighting was so intense that in some places, US forces and Japanese defenders were separated by just a few feet. Grenades were tossed back and forth like deadly exchanges in a game of catch. At Sugarloaf Hill, Marines fought for control of a single slope for over a week, losing thousands of men for ground that could be lost again in a single counterattack. But the horrors of Okinawa weren't confined to the ground. Offshore, the US Navy was enduring one of the most relentless assaults of the war, the full fury of Japan's Kamikaze campaign. For weeks, waves of Japanese pilots loaded with explosives hurled themselves at the invasion fleet. The US lost 26 ships, with hundreds more damaged. Thousands of sailors were killed or burned alive as their ships became floating infernos. For many, this was the moment when the war took on a nightmarish new dimension, where death didn't come from a distant gun or a hidden sniper, but from a pilot who had chosen to die in order to take you with him. And then there were the civilians. Okinawa wasn't just a battlefield. It was home to over 300,000 people. Families, farmers, entire villages trapped in the fighting. They fled into caves, only to be crushed by artillery or burned alive when flamethrowers were used to root out Japanese defenders. Thousands, believing American soldiers would torture or kill them, threw themselves from cliffs or took their own lives in despair. By early May, the island was becoming a graveyard, and still, the Japanese weren't giving up. By late May, Okinawa had become a war of exhaustion. The American advance was relentless but slow. Every ridge, every cave, every bunker had to be taken one by one. And the Japanese defenders, despite being cut off from resupply, refused to surrender. At the heart of this last stand was the Shuri Line, a formidable defensive network stretching across the southern part of the island. It was a natural fortress, hills reinforced with bunkers, tunnels linking hidden artillery positions, and trenches that turned every advance into a deadly trap. For weeks, US forces battered the Shuri Line with everything they had: airstrikes, naval bombardments, and continuous ground assaults. But the Japanese defenders, led by General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, had no intention of giving up. Unlike previous battles, where banzai charges wasted thousands of lives in suicidal attacks, this was an organized, disciplined defense. The Japanese made every hill and valley into a kill zone. At Daikshi Ridge, US troops fought for days just to gain a foothold. At Wana Draw, a narrow valley leading towards Shuri, the Japanese had hidden anti-tank guns in concealed positions, ambushing American Sherman tanks and grinding the advance to a halt. The fighting reached its peak at Shuri Castle, the command center of the Japanese defense. By the end of May, the Americans finally broke through the outer defenses, forcing the Japanese to retreat. But even as US troops seized the castle ruins, they found nothing. The Japanese had already withdrawn to the southern part of the island, preparing for one final stand. By early June, it was clear that the battle was nearly over. The Japanese defenses had crumbled, but instead of surrendering, thousands of soldiers launched one final attack, a desperate charge into the American lines. It was the last gasp of a dying army. By mid-June, the Shuri Line was gone. Okinawa had fallen, but victory had come at a terrible cost. For the United States, Okinawa was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Over 12,500 Americans were killed, including the highest-ranking US officer to die in combat during World War II, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who was struck by enemy artillery in the final days of the battle. Another 36,000 Americans were wounded. For the Japanese, the numbers were even more devastating. Out of an estimated 110,000 soldiers defending the island, almost all perished. Some were killed in combat, but many, following the Bushido Code of no surrender, took their own lives rather than be captured. But the greatest suffering was endured by the civilians. Okinawa wasn't just a battlefield. It was home to over 300,000 people. By the time the battle ended, at least 100,000 Okinawans were dead, a third of the island's population. Many were caught in the crossfire, bombed by both sides. Others, fearing American brutality, leapt from cliffs or were forced into mass suicides by Japanese soldiers. Entire villages were wiped out, families destroyed. The lush green hills of Okinawa, once filled with farms and fishing villages, had become a wasteland of mud, shattered trees, and unmarked graves. In the aftermath, the US prepared for what came next. Okinawa had been a test, a preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would look like, and the results were terrifying. If a single island had cost 200,000 lives, what would happen when the fight moved to Japan itself? The answer would come 2 months later, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okinawa was the last great battle of the Pacific, and in many ways, it shaped everything that followed. For the US military, Okinawa was a warning. If a single island had cost so many lives, an invasion of Japan's home islands could be catastrophic. The battle directly influenced the decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an effort to force Japan's surrender without another Okinawa, but on an even greater scale. For the Japanese, Okinawa was proof that their homeland would not be spared the war's destruction. After years of propaganda encouraging resistance to the death, The reality of Okinawa's devastation planted doubt. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender was, in part, shaped by what had already happened on Okinawa. For Okinawa itself, the scars of the battle never fully faded. The island was left in ruins. Entire villages had been wiped from existence. Mass graves covered the hills. And the survivors, those who had watched their families perish, their homes reduced to rubble, had to rebuild a world forever changed. Even today, Okinawa carries the memory of the battle. The island remains home to US military bases, a lasting legacy of its role in the war. And every year, memorials are held to remember the over 200,000 lives lost, American, Japanese, and Okinawan. Okinawa was more than just a battle. It was a tragedy, a turning point, and a final warning of what might have been, had the war continued. Okinawa was a battle of extremes, of endurance, sacrifice, and sheer destruction. It was a glimpse of what a full-scale invasion of Japan might have looked like. And in the end, it may have been the battle that convinced world leaders that such an invasion could never happen. The scars of Okinawa remain. The land itself, once a battlefield, now holds cemeteries and memorials, reminders of the thousands who died here. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Militia Historia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider subscribing and leaving a review. It helps us reach more history fans like you. And if you want to continue the conversation, you can find Militia Historia on X, Instagram, and YouTube, where we share more about military history and updates on future episodes. Next time on the podcast, we'll be diving into the story of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, another defining moment in the history of warfare. Until then, I'm Brent, and this has been the Militia Historia podcast. See you next time.